Good afternoon. My name's Aziz Huq, and I am one of FAccT'23's general chairs, along with Sarah Fox, Chen Hao Tan, and Christina Harrington. We would delighted to welcome you to the 6th FAccT conference. Yes, as everyone in this room knows, this is particularly a moment in time when debate on the issues that will be at the forefront of our discussions from this morning through to Thursday are in the public domain. And we're really excited to have an interdisciplinary and wide-ranging program that covers all sorts of perspectives on the way that new computational tools impinge upon human rights, democracy, and values that many of us care deeply about. What we're going to do is to speak for about 10 minutes to give you a little bit of a sense of how the conference will flow and a couple of ground rules. I'm going to turn over to Sarah to start that off.
So before we get to the details on the program and what you can expect over the course of the next few days, we first want to just highlight the fact that there are 817 attendees who've registered for the conference, the vast majority of them in person. So there is, first for a long time, thanks Meg for the call out. This is super impressive, and we're really ecstatic about the fact that we have so many people and so many people coming from a wide swath of disciplines, sectors, government, advocacy, et cetera. So we just want to highlight that fact. None of this would have been possible at all if it weren't for the tireless efforts of a volunteer conference chairs, a set of volunteer conference chairs that have covered everything from the program that you'll enjoy over the next few days through paper presentations, tutorials, and craft sessions. These are the people that have made this happen. We're going to reflect more on the invisible work that they have done to make all of this possible in the town hall. But these are the faces that you can thank over the course of the next few days. We also have numerous area chairs who oversaw the reviewing process for the proceedings. So all the papers were rigorously reviewed by a set of reviewers, and the area chairs were crucial to making that happen. So just highlighting each of the area chairs in each of the areas. Sure. So we also, this conference is being supported by foundations and corporations. The cost of the conference is quite steep without their support, and their contributions have made it possible that we've been able to open up the conference to a wider array of attendees than would have been possible otherwise. So a thanks to them.
Is this the clicker? We have a venue that's spread out over 2 locations, McCormick Place, which is this conference center, and the Hyatt Hotel. The Hyatt rooms are all called Jackson, and they're just down the corridor. The McCormick rooms all start with a W, and they're on toward this side. We have a number of other facilities that are available. If there is a facility that you would benefit from, would require, and it's not something that we've identified in the program or in these comments, please come find one of us. Please ask a volunteer to come find one of us, and we will do our best to facilitate. There are facilities for nursing or expressing milk, which we can provide you or direct you toward. We have a room set aside at the Hyatt if there are people who have kids and who need a place for the kids to spend some time, or to spend some time with their kids. Please let us know about that. This morning we had a coffee service. We'll have a coffee service every morning. There'll be a coffee service outside after the keynote session for today. The lunches will be provided by food carts. There's one that's being set up now in the area outside. Those food carts are going to rotate, so there's going to be a different one each day, and they're going to start operating from tomorrow. But we'd encourage you to not limit yourself to the facilities that are available here at the Hyatt and the McCormack. Chicago is one of the great cities of the United States, one of the great cities of the world. It's not a great city because there's a museum that has the loot of empire in it. It's not a great city because it's a financial capital in the way that, say, New York or London is. It's a great city because it's a tremendously multi-ethnic city. It's a city of enormous diversity with a wide range of neighborhoods that are well worth visiting, even if they're not the places that the traditional guidebooks would direct you towards. We are here, for example, very close to a couple of wonderful neighborhoods. Over on the right-hand side is an image of the Bronzeville Winery. The Bronzeville Winery is in a traditionally African-American neighborhood. It's been at the forefront of rejuvenating that neighborhood and making it a neighborhood that is both black and an example of what a neighborhood within a city can be. We're very close to a neighborhood called Pilsen, which is to the west of us. The second image here is a restaurant called Pilsen Yars, which is terrific. Pilsen's a traditionally Hispanic and predominantly Mexican neighborhood. Again, wonderful food, wonderful options there. Then finally, for those of you who want to explore a little bit more of the city, here's an example of a very old Swedish restaurant up in a neighborhood called Andersonville. That's, again, just an example of one of the many things the city has to offer. So we'd encourage you both at lunchtime and otherwise, do go out, explore the city, sample its many terrific things. Everyone has registered for the conference, and when you registered, you you agreed to what's called a community agreement. The community agreement is an extremely important component of FAccT', and we want to take a second to explain both its content and how it works. By coming to FAccT', you agree to certain expectations with respect to conduct and behavior. The three most important of those are consideration and respect in terms of the way people speak, conduct themselves, refraining from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior or speech, and being mindful of your fellow participants who come from a wide range of geographic contexts, a wide range of disciplines, and not assuming that there are things that everyone does know or needs to know or might be shamed for not knowing. We, in setting forth our community agreement, aim to go beyond the policies that ACM, the Association of Computing Machinery, has set forth. We've offered links both on our website, on the website, and we're happy to talk about what the ACM policies are. But we want to stress that our aim is very much to go beyond those policies. We do have a mechanism for reporting incidents. There's an email that's up there and that's available on the website. It's also available on Hopin. For if there are instances of concern in relation to our community agreement, and people are also free, if you don't want to email, to bring it to one of the general chairs, talk to a volunteer, they'll come find one of us, and we will talk to you. We will figure out with our terrific DEI team what we can do in relation to that. So we want to be very clear that that's a set of high expectations that we try and hold ourselves to. We also hold you to, and that we do have a mechanism whereby we will implement that on the ground. Very briefly, we have a really wonderful program, and a big part of that program are the paper sessions. We have 150 papers spread out over a series of paper sessions that are going to be in this room and some other rooms on the McCormick side over the next 4 days. Each of those paper sessions is going to be an hour long, and there are going to be 5 papers presented. One of the consequences of that is our session chairs are really going to have to be diligent about keeping each speaker on track and making sure each session ends on time out of fairness and consideration to people who are presenting in a subsequent session. We realize that having that many papers, although we hope it adds to the richness and the variety of the conference, imposes constraints upon the kind of discussion that can be had in person. We'd offer 2 ways in which when a paper you hear or that you've read engages your interest, you can engage directly with the author. The first is we've tried to provide, or we've tried to set up the venue in a way that there are many physical locations, both inside and outside, where you can engage with your colleagues. And further, on Hopin, in each of the paper sessions that is facilitated on, each of them is facilitated on Hopin. Each of them has a function that allows you, even prior to the paper being presented, to offer comments and to engage in a dialogue with the authors of that session. So we urge you also to use, even if you are physically present here, we urge you to think about and to use the Hopin as a way of engaging with authors that's particularly valuable to them because it offers them a durable record of engagement, criticism, comments, helpful and constructive ideas. It's important to flag that we have already started our substantive activities. Chen-Hao will say a little bit about what more will follow, but we wanted to flag and express our thanks for those who facilitated our online community keynote last week, which was really a terrific discussion, and our doctoral colloquium and several craft sessions, a few of which were, we had a problem in finding space in the room for all those who wanted to attend, which is a really great problem to have. But we're very grateful that those have already got going and those seem to have been a success.
Great. I'll provide some highlights of our program over the next few days. And to start with, we're going to announce 6 best papers. I guess I'll read them out. Maybe then we can congratulate them together. And the actual award certificate will be given out at each individual paper session. And the authors, if you are here, please show up at a paper session, and we'll give you an actual award, physical award as well. So the first 2 paper awards, the first one is titled Enhancing AI Fairness Through Impact Assessment in the European Union, a Legal and Computer Science Perspective, by Alessandra Calvi and Dimitris Kordzinos. Great. Yeah, thanks. I guess if you're here, you can stand up and get a well-deserved recognition. The second paper is Queer in AI, a case study in community-led participatory AI. It is written by the organizers of Queer in AI and a nice, diverse set of authors. The third one is, oh, by the way, the first one happens today, right in the very first paper session, and the second one happens on Tuesday, and the other 4 happened on Wednesday. The third one is Preventing Discriminatory Decision-Making in Evolving Data Stream, and the authors are Zichong Wang, Henry Psuta Saxena, Tongjia Yu, Sneha Karki, Tyler Zetti, Israt Hark, Shanzhou Duka Casey, Ian Stockwell, Xu Wu Wang, and Albert Byfat, and Wenbin Zhang. Then the privacy bias trade-off, data minimization, and racial disparity assessments in US government by Jennifer King, Daniel Ho, Arash Gupta, Victor Wu, and Helen Webley Brown. Congratulations. And on the impact of machine learning randomness on group fairness by Prakha Ganesh, Hongyan Chang, and Martin Strobel, and Reza Shokri. Congratulations. And last but not least, counterfactual prediction and outcome measurement error by Luke Gordon, Amanda Costin, Kenneth Houston, and Zhiwei Stephen Wu. Congratulations. In addition to the best papers, we also have a diverse list of keynotes and community keynotes. And in particular, we actually have a play titled Recursion, written by Jessica Holman and Andrew Gilman. Jessica is also one of the program chairs who served on for this conference. And with that, I'm going to hope you enjoy the entire conference and turn over to Sarah to introduce our opening keynote.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Alondra Nelson. So Dr. Nelson is the Harold F. Leonard Professor at the Institute of Advanced Study and Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Center of American Progress. She was formerly Deputy Assistant to President Biden and Acting Director at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. A scholar of science, technology, medicine, and inequity, Nelson was selected by Nature as one of the 10 people who shaped science in 2022. She is the author, most recently, of The Social Life of DNA, an award-winning exploration of the implications of direct-to-consumer genomics. Just as a side note, I actually met Dr. Nelson when I was at the University of Washington, and she was delivering a book talk and a micro seminar through the Simpson Center for Humanities, which I think kind of lends kind of voice to the fact that she's been working at this interdisciplinary intersection for a long time. And I was deeply influenced at the time by her kind of scholar activism and the impact of her work, and even more so now. While at OSTP, many of us likely know Dr. Nelson's effort to develop the AI Bill of Rights, a deeply important document to us, and it was widely circulated amongst us in our field, and is reflective of many of the concerns and insights that we share. So without further ado, I will welcome Alondra Nelson, and please join me in doing so.
Thank you so much. I had forgotten that we met at the Simpson Center, actually. That was a lovely trip. Yeah, that was a lovely trip. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So great to be here with you all. And so great to be with this extraordinary community at its 6th conference at a moment in which I think, as you said, the work that you do couldn't actually be more important or central to global society, to put a fine point on it. So I'm really excited for the conference. So thank you to Christina, to Sarah, to Chen Hao, and to Aziz, and to all of the people who planned this conference. It was great to see how intentional this new field has gone about the work of creating itself, of constituting itself, everything from the awards it presents to the broad community it uses to organize itself. All right, so as Sarah mentioned, until a few months ago, I was in Washington, D.C. During policy work. I was out of my job as a professor for a couple of years. This is not advancing. Oh, it's advancing too far. Okay. Gone too far. Okay. And so I've just been sort of restarting my research program and coming out into my research program into the sort of whirlwind that is this particular AI moment. And so I've been thinking quite a lot about, as probably you are, about the work that you've done to actually help us think about this moment. And then what I want to offer today, I think, for all of us is sort of how we might think about where we go next. I think one of the the sort of upsides and downsides for a field as extraordinary as you all, for a group of colleagues who have started a field together, is 6 conferences in, you have to look up and say, what happens if we succeed, and what do we do next? And I hope that you take from the public debates about artificial intelligence and the fact that we can have a public debate about it, a sense of great sort of success and accomplishment, but also as a kind of call to arms for all that needs to come. So I've been trying to think about alignment variously. I mean, obviously, because it's a kind of term of art for colleagues of ours who work on the technical side in generative AI. But I've been trying to think about it as well because it's also often tethered with a kind of confidence around what values are, that we know what human values are, that we know what it means to align with them, and that is the easy part. And so I've been trying to sort of think through, and this talk is more questions than answers, what it might mean to think through alignment as a puzzle, as a kind of research problem. So like you, I've been sort of captured by all of the headlines about AI, and I've actually been quite struck by how long and sticky they have been in the news cycle. I think I know you all are exhausted, any of us who work in the field are exhausted, and I keep thinking like, oh, next week something else is gonna take the news cycle. And it just sort of goes and goes, and it's been the case for almost 6 months. It's been actually quite extraordinary. So the alignment problem, as it's commonly understood, right, it concerns how we can build AI models and systems and tools in a way that's compatible with human moral and human values, right? Sometimes human values is used, sometimes ethics or ethical values. In the UN's Our Common Ground report, there's a kind of rendering of even global values. And what's been interesting is that the sort of presentation of the alignment problem often is that there are hard problems, difficult challenges. Indeed, some may be impossible to solve on the technical side of what one might do for AI alignment. But rarely are these same questions asked about the morals or the principle side. And the assumption, moreover, is often that they're just actually probably not that hard. It's the technical stuff we really need to figure out. But I think those of us who work in the space of humanities and social sciences know that civilizations for eons, for millennia, choose your long time scale, have been struggling, fighting, arguing, debating over human values and principles as well. So I want to kind of think about what it might mean to take seriously that the values piece, be those human values, democratic values, ethics, or global values, is the hard stuff, and how we might begin to, what tools we might need to think about that. So I borrow the word thick alignment, the title of my talk, from obviously a history and philosophy and ethnography and the interpretive social sciences of the concept of thick description. So I'll take you back a little bit to remind you about this. So this thick description comes to us from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, 1949. He's also notably the person who coined the phrase ghost in the machine, which I think has obvious resonance with our discussions over the last few months. So for him, there were kind of 2 different ways of describing the same piece of behavior. On the one hand, for him it was quite simplistic, actually. I think if he would say, it was quantitative and qualitative. So the thin description for him was the sort of just bare kind of description, and then there was the thick description. So his classic model in his 1949, or classic example in 1949 essay, was thin description. So he talks about a boy and says the boy is doing something with his eye and says, what does this contraction of the eye mean? Is it a wink or is it a twitch? So this is not a dynamic image, and so we can't sort of ask that question. What does the rapid contracting of this eye mean? But in this case, because it's static, we might say, is there something in his eye? So moving from the description, somebody is contracting this boy is contracting his eyelid, to what Ryle called thick description. So is, understanding, getting the tools and the context that you need to understand whether or not it was a wink or a twitch or something else, requires a different kind of processes and different tools that are interpretive, that are communicative, that offer some meaning and context to this behavior. Why is it done? How is it read? Using what social codes? So more famously for many of us would be Clifford Geertz's uptake of thick description in 1973, and a book called In the Interpretation of Culture. There's a famous book called Deep Play on the Balinese Cockfight. I don't know if some of you might have read it. It's a kind of canonical essay for ethnographers and people who do qualitative research. So the interesting thing in this moment of the Geertz essay, of the Geertz book and essay, is that it was kind of revolutionary for anthropology, this moment on the interpretation of cultures, because he was arguing that thick description was an important method of analysis that sought not just to describe, but to also help us comprehend, because we were kind of digging in to the context of things and asking questions about meaning. So we sort of use this, I think, in popular parlance now, but it's also been up for critique, and I don't want to sort of begin to sort of dash out with it, which is very much my beta version of thick alignment, without sort of talking about some of the critiques, two important ones in particular, about thick description. So two in brief, the book Thin Description by John Jackson. There's probably some Annenberg students here, or former students, who's the dean of the Annenberg School and soon to be provost of the University of Pennsylvania. So his book Thin Description is a critique of Geertz, in part because Geertz's thick description assumed a kind of God-eye perspective, right? That like somehow the person who was doing the describing had a sort of privileged perspective that they could, uniquely sort of understand what was happening in a community. Now that unique perspective, of course, came from being an ethnographer, from being engaged in a community, from knowing people in a community. But John wants us to also understand that it suggested that there was a perspective that could be had or known in a particular way that was comprehensive, that I think many of us would be, doubtful of in this moment. On the other hand, there is an essay by Heather Love in the journal Public Culture that came out just a couple of years ago, called Close Reading and Thin Description, in which she makes the case for thin description as not something that we need to sort of turn over wholesale and critique, but that can be really useful. So Heather Love argues, and she does a reading of both the work of Ryle and also of the sociologist Irving Hoffman, that we need to think about observed behavior and its sort of microanalysis. That microanalyses are helpful for us because you can then compare, you can use them as sort of data for kind of comparative analyses, and also it allows us in her rendering to read across disciplines. So two cautions about thickness that we might want to keep in mind as we move forward. And as moving forward, I also want to say first a word about, in talking about alignment, and before I say a few words about thick alignment, I want to say something about misalignment, which is of a piece often with the conversations about alignment. Before the kind of generative AI turn, I think many of our most common instances of misalignment were about atrocious cases like that reported by Julia Angwin and colleagues at ProPublica. This is a classic now 2016 essay, Machine Bias, about the Compass algorithmic model and the way it discriminated against African Americans. So I want us also to remember sort of bias as misalignment, because as alignment and misalignment get sort of taken up in more recent sort of parlance, I think that we can forget that misalignment is maybe just discrimination, or that misalignment assumes, and alignment assumes, some prior halcyon state, some prior good state of equilibrium in which the algorithm or in which the system or the model was actually working well. And I think that what this case tells us, and what thinking about the bias cases of misalignment suggests for us, is that in some ways, this is working as it should in a society that's unequal, in a society that's racially discriminatory. And so the suggestion, while it is an aspirational suggestion, that alignment would mean you would not have recidivism tools that would disproportionately forecast sort of bad outcomes for African Americans. It also suggests that we know that alignment is a kind of steady state or state of equilibrium in which we know what the values are. So I want to sort of bring the conversation about what values are and how they matter, also to the question of misalignment. And to make a designation of misalignment assumes that we know what the good state is, what the good life is. I also want to say, before I move on, that we might think of misalignment actually as instances in which we distill and convey human values, right? So if we think about sort of training data and data sets and how they move forward, the work of the past, that the misalignment actually is in some ways a representation of the steady state of society or the steady state of the world, and not a sort of error or an accident in an otherwise perfect state of affairs. All right, so I'm going to try kind of 3 goes. This is my beta on thick alignment. So I'm going to offer kind of 3 interrelated kinds of conceptual frameworks for what it is. So the first, thick alignment, socio-technical approaches to the analysis of AI systems, models, and tools that employ description and contextual analysis, right? So that use cases, that think about incentives, that think about power, that think about meaning. And in so doing, both reflect and constitute human values. So the thing I want to say, I think, about this concept that I'm going to think through is that I purposely did not use the word ethics. I didn't use the word ethics because I think it's important that we think about the social relationships and and explicitly used incentives and power to think about socio-technical approaches and the ways that they create value. So that value is not a thing that exists and that you take a system and sort of compare it to, right? That these systems sort of are creating value and in the way that they create incentives, meaning, and power, and therefore sort of sort society. Let's see, another slice of this. Thick alignment. Socio-technical research and analysis in which human values are interrogated across the life cycle of an AI model, system, or tool, including potential risks or benefits. So I'll say a little bit more about this. I have a slide that's called Values All the Way Down, but part of how we're thinking about AI alignment, particularly after the generative AI or the advanced AI turn, is really about a sort of tool or system or model and the values that it's supposed to encode and then instantiate when it's deployed. As opposed to, as we increasingly are thinking about sort of pre-deployment training data, post-deployment, thinking about the necessity of thinking about values across that entire life cycle and what that might mean. So I'm not sure exactly what that means in practice, and I think it's a hard thing, but I want us to sort of, but part of the provocation here is to not think about the human values piece again and again, each of these provocations, as a static thing, as a thing that we know, as opposed to something that's sort of, at the very least, changing and moving and dynamic in space across the life cycle of a particular tool that we might study. All right, and my third crack at this. Thick alignment entails socio-technical strategies that foster deliberative and representative approaches to steering AI systems, models, and tools with human values and priorities. And here I'm trying to get at the who gets to decide, who gets to participate in a deliberative democracy or a deliberative process that allows the values that are then encoded into technologies to be the ones. Who makes the choice, who decides? I'll say a little bit more about that. So 3 cracks of that I'm trying to come to this, and I will I'll sort of go a little bit granular with each of these in the remaining slides and time I have. Okay, so first, values all the way down. Let me switch I'm doing the 2-slide things here. So the question here is really about those kind of first order questions and the questions that we sort of have to keep asking ourselves about all technological systems and tools actually, but we can keep AI in mind. So these are questions like, what are the conditions under which conditions are these AI systems and tools being developed? What society or community wants these systems and tools to be developed, if any? Who decides when and how AI systems and tools are deployed, and what through what processes, and who benefits. And then one might ask questions later on in the life cycle, questions about deployment and use, for whom, by whom, and understanding all the way that sort of societies and values are constituted as the sort of cycle of the answers to these questions iterate. All right. Okay, moving from values to policy. Here, I wanted to say a little bit about the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, in part because it is a document, an artifact that comes out of this community, that there were researchers from this community that helped to build out this work. And in part because I want us to think about FAccT alignment as a way in which the values then became not just encoded, as we would talk about in like a generative AI system or a large language model, right? But also instantiated in society, right? So just telling you what you already know, these are the sort of 5 principles of the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. But of course, each of these principles come with practices in industry, practices for government and for governance, and things that both can be done both upstream and downstream in the design and deployment process. And so I would ask us to consider, as we're thinking about alignment, that FAccT alignment is a way for us to think about what are the political processes and the governance processes and the processes of deliberation that we want to have in a society in which we've got sort of technical mediation and the way that we live our lives, including through AI. And I offer the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights as one way of thinking about this. Let's see what we have here. Sorry, I'm trying to align my slides here. Okay. So I think what one of the benefits that a concept like technical or that FAccT alignment or an approach like FAccT alignment offers is a way for us to think about inscrutability, the inscrutability of, for example, large language models that are presented to us as in some ways, as hurdles to agency, as hurdles to both agency in the research space, as hurdles to agency in the political space or in the space of democracy. So I want to suggest that the inscrutability of a technical system is itself social knowledge. So that the fact that it is inscrutable tells us things about the incentive structures, the power, the things that came to constitute it. It tells us it tells us something about values, both human values, democratic values, and potentially global values as well. And that a black box system that we also often talk about as a kind of negation, that we often lament wanting to have more access to, which of course we do. We want more access to black box systems so that we can understand them. But the fact of the black box system itself reveals a system of power that I think is worth interrogating and not just lamenting. I've been thinking about a context, a particular concept or an instantiation of this that I'm calling algorithmic agnotology. So as Sarah indicated in my introduction, I come to this conversation through my work in the field of science and technology studies, science and technology policy. And for a long time in that field now, there's been effectively a study of ignorance, a kind of politics of agnotology, the study of kind of feigned ignorance in the work that we do. This literature in the science and technology studies community is often thought about with regards to large tobacco companies, so big pharma, big tobacco, and the ways that knowledge about systems, knowledge about supply chains, knowledge about how corporations and the ways that they wield power work or are sort of obscured or made inscrutable to the work that we do. So this is a kind of politics of ignorance, of deliberate ignorance that is sometimes the flip side of uncertainty and ambiguity. And I want to suggest that as we try to find our way through this sort of large turn with regards to artificial intelligence, that we might think about querying the technical choices that were being offered by industry with regards to artificial intelligence. And because I work in part at an organization, the Institute for Advanced Study, where I work with physicists and mathematicians who are working every day on things that we were told can't ever be done, I want to insist that we question the agnotology, that it's an actual fruitful way of going about the research, the work of a FAccT community, for example, and that we are sort of mindful of the algorithmic agnotology that is taking place when we're told that systems can't be known to us, and therefore that nothing can happen to change them or to change the conditions in which they exist or the ways that they do their work and yield their power. So lastly, just want to say a little bit about scenarios and simulations. So one of the ways, of course, that we try to get insight into systems the unknowable, we've been having lots of conversations about what might happen in the future and what is unknowable, is through simulation and scenario building. One of the interesting, so I wanted to offer, and this is my last slide here, that one consideration for thick alignment is to always hold at a high level the sort of question of the future that we want to live in, of the life that we want to have. So this is a quote from W.B. Du Bois. This is from his senior essay in 1898, and it's called The Renaissance of Ethics. He offers for us that given a universe with two possible futures, and the question becomes to each individual, how much difference will it make if this be tomorrow's universe rather than that? In other words, the great question of the world asks is how much better is the best possible universe I can help make than the worst possible one? So I would leave that with you as a question for the work that we have to do together as we build possible scenarios, and I thank you for your time.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. Fantastic talk. Excited to engage in some discussion with the group in just a moment. First, I'll launch off with a question, and then we'll turn over to a question from Hopin, and then we'll open up to the group. And I ask that when folks come up to the mic, they actually come up to the mic first and foremost, so not standing up and shouting out, but instead coming up to the mic because that's how people online can hear. But also identify yourselves in whatever way you choose, so name and whatever else you feel is important to share. So I'll just start off. I'm really intrigued by this notion of algorithmic agnotology. I'm familiar with the work that you described kind of in the STS community and thinking about the politics and the kind of engineered ignorance that we kind of take as given. And I'm also really intrigued by these discussion you had earlier on in your talk about kind of participatory governance strategies and mechanisms for doing that. And I'm wondering if you could speak on the space between. Kind of interrogating that false ignorance, that kind of engineered ignorance. So maybe that's the job of the scholarly community, is to kind of really put the feet to the fire, so to speak, on that. And then when we get there, perhaps, what space do you see for kind of more collective, more participatory approaches to governing those various systems that we have kind of opened up and peeled back?
Thank you for those, and thank you for linking that together. It's really helpful. So I think, Sarah, to start, I would say that that the sort of feigned ignorance, the engineered ignorance, also works to disempower people who need to gauge the conversation. So I think it's certainly the case that that those of us who are scholars, I think, need to dig into the space. I mean, that also means, thinking about creating models in different ways, thinking about not deploying things before we know more about them, being careful about where we deploy things and what we know when we do. But at the same time, it means because the the sort of values piece is so important here for all technologies, but particularly for this sort of quick move into in a society so mediated by artificial intelligence. It means that sort of big questions are at stake and on the table, and that people need to, the sort of generative, productive, useful thing about the values piece, and I think why we should continue to dig into that piece with kind of new verve and new strategies, is that people always will have an opinion or aspiration for what they want their world and their society to look like, and they might not know anything about an AI model, and that's okay, and I think they don't have to. That's like, it's our job to know that. And so I think, so that's the one side. On the other side, what we know from the work on sort of big tech, in particular big tobacco and agnotology, Naomi Oreskes, for example, writes quite a lot about this, is that that sort of engineered ignorance does the work of consolidating power, of consolidating, monopolies, of people being able to deploy things and say they don't know how to do it, they wish they could, when it's a fact that they could if they wanted to spend a little bit more money or take a little bit more time before they shipped product and these sorts of things. And so I would say there's a role both for illumination on the part of scholars and also on the participatory democracy side. The latter is actually one of the things that I'm most interested in and about. I mean, you all are, through the very ways in which you're setting up your conference, are really making space for that here, which I think is tremendously exciting and admirable. But it's a big challenge for us. I mean, if it's the case that we're facing, a future where there will be significant displacements in how people do their work and do their jobs, how they live their lives, and these sorts of things. There needs to be a way to have participation in that doesn't require that you have a PhD in computer science, for example. And everyone doesn't agree that that's the case, I mean, there are people who think that, only computer science experts should have a role and sort of carving out that participatory space. So I think it's a great opportunity to, I think about democracy in new ways and think about how to have people participate in it. You had people here, I think, from 35 countries. Some of them are probably in Europe, where things like assemblies and other sorts of democratic processes are well developed, unlike the United States, is something that we should certainly think about. Yeah, thanks. Hi. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we do have one question from Hopin. This is from Yenan Long, and the question is, given the vast range of possible societal values, how can we avoid slipping into relativism?
Oh, that's a great question. I think deliberative and participatory processes is one, but I think that there are also, I think when you often say to technical people that we need to think that the value side is hard and we need to dig into the value side, that's often the reply that you get. And, there's a level, I think, at which sort of people can often agree, like people should have homes. I'm being a little bit sort of glib here, but, people should have food to eat. People should be, have shelter from, climate change, these sorts of things. And as you go sort of farther down that list, those are where the kind of debates and the battles fight, what people, who, and how to think about those. But the values piece doesn't have to be everyone's individual, gesture about what they think is good and beautiful in the world, that we make collective decisions as a society about fundamental things like housing and food and healthcare and the like, all of which, new forms of technology used in the wrong ways threaten to disrupt.
Hi. Thank you very much for being here. It's an honor to be talking to you, doctor, professor. My name is Carlos. I'm nobody in particular. I'm just a humble bureaucrat. I'm on leave from the World Bank, and good disclaimer, I do not speak for the World Bank in any way, shape, or form. I kind of built my life around universal institutions that happen to be based here in the United States. And I was wondering, a lot of you talk about these definitions, and I was thinking institution building. some folks talk a lot about how we might need an institution to coordinate global efforts when it comes to AI. I was wondering how you see this institutional building effort. There were some kind of suggestions in international development, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And again, I do not speak for the World Bank in any way, shape, or form, and it's just a humble coincidence that the president of the World Bank just came in this month, so thank you.
Thank you for your question, Carlos, and thank you for your service. I think all of us should have a stint as a humble bureaucrat. I think it teaches us quite a lot. So that's, I guess, one of the big questions, what should be the international response? And I don't know that there's an easy answer, although lots of folks like to go on television and say there's lots of easy answers. I think it's probably a quilt of things that we know. I mean, I know that you can't speak as a World Bank person, but your question makes me want to think about the kind of governance structure of the World Bank and know a little bit more about that, because I hadn't thought about that example. But the examples that folks are talking about make sense, right? The IAEA thinking about nuclear nonproliferation and, thinking about another space in which there is a quote-unquote race. You might think about, the OECD is already doing great work here. I mean, the OECD's work has not only principles, but like all sorts of, dashboards and platforms and things for tools to really get some traction on this. I think the challenge we face, and this is the looming question for me about any kind of international model, and I don't have analogs for it yet, is that the commercial incentives are so deeply misaligned to any kind of the other international models. A lot of the other ones we think about are state actors or civil society actors sort of engaged multilaterally. And these, if we're being honest, are American multinational corporations without a lot of incentive to, I think, collaborate in some ways. Market incentives, that is. Although I will take colleagues' good faith pronouncements that they're in, that they want to engage in international work. So it feels like a little bit of a harder problem. I mean, imagine thinking that something's a harder problem than NATO or the G7, but the sort of commercial imperative here seems to be a difference in kind that I think that we've got to think through, and I don't have an answer for that. And that's why I think that all of the models that we're talking about will be in some way satisfactory, because we don't really have an analog for that, I think, in these other models.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing? This is an enthralling talk. I hung on every word, and I really want to understand why thickness and why alignment? Mm-hmm. Because thickness, it does have this kind of loadedness in the kind of critique that
Yep.
and I came to the kind of thin description mostly through Dr. Benjamin's work and kind of her take on this in the way of thinking about reading, like thin description as a way of reading kind of the racialization of technology throughout, and that is being such an important metric. But then the alignment problem itself is also constituted so much, especially through people who work on artificial general intelligence, I think you've rightly pointed out the problems with it. So I'm wondering, as an analytic, what work does rehabituating thickness and alignment do to what sounds like a very participatory, deliberative project of directing AI? I'll leave it there.
That is a great question. So I'll start where you end. So the participatory piece requires thickness, right? It actually that is not a singular or thin or static way of kind of thinking about or imagining or being in or analyzing the social world. And so the participatory nature of it, democracy, I think, inherently is a kind of thickness. And so that's what I would offer an initial response. On the alignment piece, I think, we were using alignment, and that's why I brought misalignment and wanted to come back and have that moment. well before there was a public turn in generative AI, although sort of chatbots and LLMs were sort of circulating in industry long before that. And I think it is, I think what societies sort of try to do with democracy, with governance, is a kind of alignment. And so I think it's not a kind of resuscitation, it's actually a like correction or a kind of co-optation, I think is the gesture that I'm attempting here, although I completely take your point. I do think fundamentally that from the kind of STS tradition and the sociology of technology tradition, that there has been, I think, various kind of intellectual schools of thought that are effectively engaged in what's been called alignment, right? The socio-technical approach to things is partly, I think, trying to make that the case, but very much take the critique on that as well. Thank you.
So we have another question from Hopen, and this is an anonymous question. It asks, how do we move from participation to co-ownership? I worry that, quote, participation promotes a model in which academics and scientists are still considered the people who will make decisions, whereas co-ownership shifts power structures more fundamentally.
Oh, I wish that person was here, or they usually still have access to them, because ownership is like it's a quite specific kind of social thing. Gosh, I mean, I think that participation, let me try to sort of tease out ownership from the like capitalist. That's what if this person was here, I'd want to be like, do you mean that in like the capitalist sense of like owning the means of production or something else? I will just simply say that that I think participation is a predicate to, I think, any kind of a meaningful collaborative governance of anything. So like if the people need to not be given, but have a seat at the table for themselves to enter into conversations. And then, I also just think like for the space of technology, like the market dominance is such that I'm just trying to even like imagine. That's why I wish the person was here to ask about the ownership piece. But I think that it's important that people participate. And I think, so I would say this. I would say that the threshold of participation when you're dealing with socio-technical issues is actually higher than other things. And so I think that the sort of value add or the valence of participation is actually centrally important because of the sort of agnotology, because people tell you that it's super, super important and really, really serious and really hard and you can't possibly understand it. So I think the sort of degree of difficulty of participation in technical governance spaces actually is worth being mindful of as well. Thank you for that question, whoever. Hi, Seth.
Hey, Seth Lazar, a philosopher from the Australian National University. I really love the concept of thick alignment. I find it incredibly evocative. I wondered if you could say a bit more about how thick alignment contrasts with thin alignment when it comes to steering large AI models. Do you think that existing work on alignment makes adequate use of the socio-technical tools that have been developed and showcased here at FAccT', among other places? And if not, what do you think should be done next?
Oh, great. Thank you for that question. It was the kind of implicit in what I said, but your question makes it clear that I didn't say it explicitly. I mean, certainly the thing that I am, I think, arguing against in some ways is the fact that what we currently call alignment is sort of deeply thin. It's problematically thin. And I think in this way, it would be similar to Ryle and his critique of the sort of merely quantitative as a challenge for having any kind of conception of the social world, particularly one that's intended to be able to tell us something or, God forbid, encode values in it. So I think that it's been interesting to, on the one hand, have sort of cautions raised from this community, from other communities about the risks and dangers of AI and other kinds of AI tools, and then in response to them, sort of have a response that is sort of digging down deeper into a merely technical space. That is supposed to be encoding values, but that sort of doesn't take or make the effort to engage in a kind of space in which values could be debated, articulated, and indeed encoded, if values can even be deliberately encoded in technology in the way they're being intended. So it's intended in some ways as a critique, and I think this links to Alex's question as well. But a critique that I think I don't want to give up the fact that that we should steer our technologies with democratic values. I think that's a fundamental thing I don't want to give up. And so the question becomes how to think about that and to reimagine both what it means to have these values in the technical space and then to encode them in the work that we do.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic talk. Shannon Valor, a philosopher from the University of Edinburgh. And I wanted to, I think it's a two-part question, but it's closely related. So I very much appreciated your response to Alex's question and the commitment to the fact that democratic and participatory practices are themselves driven by a certain conception of value, and there's no getting a thick conception of value that there's no way of getting away from. So I wanted to know if you agree that what we might actually need in some ways is to make more explicit a communal commitment to a certain value frame in which, I mean, even the sharing of power, right? So we talk about interrogating the concentration of power. Well, that presumes that we think that's a bad thing. And we see as the rise of authoritarianism across the world and even in many tech circles, that it's no longer taken for granted, right? That the kinds of power arrangements we're seeing are undesirable. So is perhaps the strategy that we need one of actually recommitting to a set of shared values that we're willing to fight for?
Yep.
And the second part of the question is, how do we do that in light of what I see as a rhetorical turn, a strategic turn to a particular conception of safety and existential risk as a context for that, right? That allows us, or allows some actors to resist this other value frame by saying safety trumps all, right? Safety is more important than fairness. Safety's got to be more important than equity. Safety's got to be more important than transparency, right? So I'd like to know if you also fear that this is the strategic shift that's happening and how we can resist that without denying that safety matters, of course.
Yeah, those are great comments and questions. So I think the strategy for the set of shared values is exactly right. I mean, it was partly why I wanted to share, let me go back to the great, I hope this great FACT work, which it is, because, you know, and this goes to your point actually, is it Sharon or Shannon about safe, about right? So that the first principle is safe and effective systems, right? And that the question then becomes like, you know, if the tools are the technologies are the tools that are for our use and for, you know, the public good, the public betterment, however we sort of fight over and define what that is, we have set the sort of anchors as these sort of social goals. And I think what I was saying to the question, somebody who asked the question earlier about going up a level high enough that one can agree upon at least a starting point for precisely the communal commitments that you say. So that's when it gets really hard and really ugly, but I think that we need to go up a high enough level, data privacy, to be able to at least begin the fight. And right now I think there's just a lot of like scrambling and tactics and actually not strategies, if we're being frank. I think I would say on the sort of safety and existential risk question is complicated for me as a sociologist of science, because, so I'm gonna answer you as I'm answer a philosopher as a sociologist. So it's been fascinating to watch when I can allow myself a little window of just not thinking about only about the sort of gravity of the stakes of it, to watch how that field has constituted itself, to watch that field citation practices, I mean, sort of all of the things that sociology of knowledge and sociology of science folks think about it's a bit of a textbook case in some ways of how one would build a field, and so it's been. So I'm not quite dodging your question, but I've just been actually quite interesting to watch that, and also to think about the explicitly alternative, purposeful, intentional community that was built in parallel at FAccT'. And so if we think, this is me with my sociology hat on, about two epistemological projects and communities emerging at about the same time, and the institutional structures that they choose to take to instantiate the work that they think is important in the world, I think that's amazingly kind of fascinating and interesting and rich through and through with the values and choices that people have made about the work. I'll leave that as my answer. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ajay Devakaran. I'm actually a computer vision and machine learning researcher. But I was struck by, well, first of all, your clarity and authority are just amazing. But anyway, I'm moving right along. So you made this comment about some people believing that only computer scientists should approach this because the systems are. So I've been mulling over that, and I wanted you to sort of respond to these sort of questions that I have in my mind. One thing is, I mean, this is not exactly unprecedented, is it? I mean, when airplanes were built, were only aeronautical engineers deciding what the rules would be around aviation. So why this new angle from this set is a question that struck me. The other question that strikes me is that the claims that are being made far exceed the epistemological grasp that computer scientists actually have, because there are so many stakeholders and there are so many impacts that you would need a much wider epistemological framework than anything that exists in computer science right now.
Correct.
So it has been a head scratcher for me as someone who's actually a pretty technical person, what the source of, if I may say, this kind of arrogance is, and why is it even something that is even, that is accorded even a shred of legitimacy. Thank you.
So I don't. So I think that the answer to both of your questions is kind of nested in one thing, and it is about the kind of exceptionalism that we lend to certain kinds, to artificial intelligence. I mean, if you're thinking about the physical sciences, you think about physics versus other things, like they're supposed to be these spaces that have the most kind of prestige and privilege and arrogance. I mean, in the social sciences, one might point to The Economist, but I shout out to all of my economist friends that I love as sort of being fields that are understood to be more important or more significant and the like. And so I think why we don't think, in fact, actually we don't think that you need to be a developer or a real estate agent to have a say about housing policy. So I'm not saying, do you need to, are you the person who is writing the policy? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we treat computer science and particularly artificial intelligence as if one cannot even have an opinion about where the work should be going and what it should do in the world without having a particular kind of technical background. And there's all sorts of, so use your point about the airplanes. I mean, we don't, people are allowed to have opinions about, the FAA and about policy in that space without having to know how to fly a plane. And I think most people who make policy in that space don't know how to fly a plane or are not, aeronautical engineers. And so I would throw the question back to you and say, why does artificial intelligence and forms of computer science become this sort of state of exception where the ways in which we typically would expect people to engage, have opinions, push back, don't happen, aren't available. And so some of what I was trying to point out, things like the agnotology or the sort of, are the ways in which people, I think, are kept away from being able to engage in that space. Thank you.
So thank you again for the really illuminating talk, and thank you everyone for the brilliant and thoughtful questions. I think it kind of added to the learnings for this opening keynote, and I encourage you to kind of hang back if you have remaining questions, if you're in person. Hopefully Dr. Nelson can have a little bit of time to chat. There's also the Hopin platform should you want to continue the conversation via chat there. So join me again in thanking Dr. Nelson. Thank you. And welcome to the conference.